LaToya Harris stands trembling in a Crestmont courtroom, wrists chafed from cuffs just peeled off, staring into Judge Virgil Hensley's smug, leering smirk as he sentences her to 10 years for a theft she never committed. The air thickens, her 8-year-old son Jamal's terrified eyes burning in her mind. She screams her innocence, but the gavel crashes. Then, a shadow moves, a folded note slides into her hand. FBI knows. Is this her end, or a lifeline? Veiled in chaos, her future teeters on a razor's edge. Before we dive into this wild tale, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit like and subscribe to catch every twist coming. Your way. What's next for LaToya? 3 weeks before that suffocating courtroom moment, LaToya Harris woke to the sticky heat of Crestmont, Georgia, a small southern town where the air clung like damp cotton and the past lingered in every cracked sidewalk. Her one-bedroom apartment buzzed with the hum of a cheap fan, pushing stale warmth around as she shuffled to the kitchen in worn slippers. She flicked on the coffee maker, its gurgle a faint comfort against the unease gnawing at her gut. At 32, LaToya carried the weight of a life fought for tooth and nail. A single mother who'd clawed her way out of poverty with a degree and a job she'd once been proud of. Her 8-year-old son, Jamal, sat at their wobbly table, spooning soggy cereal into his mouth, humming a tune from some cartoon he'd watched the night before. His round face, all big eyes and gap-toothed grins, was her anchor, the reason she got up every morning despite the world's relentless kicks. She ruffled his hair, forcing a smile as she poured black coffee into a chipped mug, the bitter steam curling up to meet her tired eyes. Today felt off, though she couldn't pin why. A shadow creeping under her skin she tried to shake loose. She had to be strong for Jamal, had to keep their little life stitched together. LaToya worked as an accountant at First Trust Bank, a squat, brick building downtown, where the air conditioning wheezed and the fluorescent lights flickered like a dying pulse. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, barely. She'd been there 4 years, crunching numbers with a precision that earned her quiet respect from most co-workers, though the pay stayed stubbornly low, a fact she swallowed without complaint. Not everyone liked her presence, though. Darren Phelps, a wiry white man with a perpetual scowl, sat 2 cubicles over, his nasally voice cutting through the hum of printers and keyboards every day. He'd mutter token higher under his breath whenever she walked by, loud enough for her to hear but soft enough to dodge a real fight. She'd clench her fists, bite her tongue and keep moving, knowing a complaint would only paint a bigger target on her back. Darren's sneers were a daily tax she paid for existing in a space that didn't want her, a reminder that Crestmont's old blood didn't take kindly to black women with degrees stepping into their world. She'd learned to navigate it, to keep her head down and her work flawless, proving herself twice over just to breathe the same air. That morning, she'd barely settled into her chair, her computer screen blinking to life, when Mr. Carver, her boss, loomed over her desk. He was a stocky man in his 50s, balding with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead, his tie always slightly askew like he'd given up halfway through knotting it. His voice came sharp, cutting through the office din. LaToya, my office. Now. She frowned, glancing at the spreadsheet she'd just opened, numbers she'd triple-checked the day before. Something in his tone prickled her spine, but she stood, smoothing her skirt, and followed him past Darren's smirk into the glass-walled room that smelled of stale cigars and leather polish. Carver didn't sit, just leaned against his desk, arms crossed, staring at her like she'd spat in his coffee. "We've got a problem," he said, his eyes narrowing. $20,000 missing from client accounts. Your accounts. LaToya's stomach lurched, her mouth going dry as she shook her head. "That's impossible, sir. I don't even have clearance for transfers that big." He cut her off, tossing a stack of printouts onto the desk, her login stamped across every fraudulent transaction. "This says different. You're done here, fired, pack your stuff." She stumbled over her words, heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribs. "Sir, those aren't mine. I can show you my records, my backups, everything's clean." She pulled a USB drive from her purse, hands trembling as she plugged it into his computer, opening files she'd meticulously saved. Timestamps, approvals, every move tracked. "See? Nothing matches those dates. Someone set me up." Carver barely glanced at the screen, his lips twisting into a thin, cold line. "Doesn't matter. Evidence says you did it. Get out before I call security." Latoya's breath hitched, her mind racing as she yanked the drive free, clutching it like a lifeline. She wanted to scream, to demand he listen, but Darren's snicker from outside the glass stopped her cold. She saw it then, the glint in Carver's eyes, the same one Darren wore daily. Disdain, layered thick with something uglier. She grabbed her bag, legs unsteady, and walked out, the office's silence roaring in her ears as every head turned, whispers slithering behind her. Fired, accused, a thief. The words branded her before she even hit the parking lot. She drove home in a daze, the old Honda's engine rattling under her grip, tears stinging but refusing to fall. Jamal needed her steady, not broken. She'd figure this out, clear her name somehow. She'd faced worse, hadn't she? Growing up in a crumbling Atlanta neighborhood, dodging bullets and hunger, she'd fought for every scholarship, every chance. This was just another hill, steep but climbable. She pulled into her apartment complex, a sagging brick box with peeling paint and a flickering streetlight, and climbed the stairs, rehearsing how to tell Jamal she'd be home more now, spinning it like a gift. But as she fumbled with her keys, the lock clicking open, a siren wailed closer, red and blue lights splashing across the walls. Her heart sank, a sick premonition twisting her gut. She stepped inside, calling for Jamal, only to see him huddled on the couch, eyes wide as 3 cops burst through the door she'd barely shut. "Latoya Harris, you're under arrest for theft and fraud," one barked. A burly man with a buzz cut and a sneer, his badge glinting under the dim bulb. She froze, hands up as Jamal shrieked, "Mama!" The other 2 tore into her home, flipping cushions, dumping drawers, their boots grinding dirt into the carpet she'd vacuumed that morning. "This is a mistake," she said, voice cracking as cuffs snapped around her wrists, cold metal biting her skin. "I didn't steal anything. Check my records." The buzz-cut cop snorted, shoving her toward the door. "Tell it to the judge, sweetheart." Jamal lunged, clinging to her leg, sobbing as a female officer peeled him off, his wails echoing down the hall. "Take him to the neighbor," Latoya pleaded, twisting to see his tear-streaked face. "Mrs. Ellis, apartment 6, please." The woman nodded curtly, dragging Jamal away as Latoya stumbled down the stairs, the cuffs chafing, neighbors peering from cracked blinds. Outside, a crowd had gathered, phones raised, filming her perp. Walk across the patchy lawn. "Thieving trash," someone muttered, loud enough to slice through the humid air. She recognized the voice, old man Tucker from downstairs, his usual grumble now venomous. Others joined in, a chorus of slurs and jeers. Typical, should have known. The words pelting her like stones. She kept her chin up, eyes locked on the squad car, refusing to let them see her crack. The cops shoved her into the back seat, the door slamming with a finality that rattled her bones. Through the window, she saw Jamal's tiny figure at Mrs. Ellis's door, his cries muffled but piercing. The car lurched forward, tires crunching gravel, and Crestmont blurred past, a town she'd tried to call home now spitting her out. At the station, they fingerprinted her, the ink staining her hands like a mark she couldn't wash off. The mugshot flash blinded her, freezing her stunned face for the record. She sat in a holding cell, concrete walls sweating in the heat, replaying Carver's accusation, the cops' rough hands, the crowd's hate. She hadn't stolen a dime, hadn't even jaywalked since moving here. Why her? The USB drive burned in her pocket, proof she'd cling to, but doubt crept in. Who'd listen to a black woman with no money, no connections in a place like this? The town's whispers had already convicted her, a thief in their eyes before she'd even seen a courtroom. She hugged her knees, the cell's dank air choking her resolve. 3 weeks from now, she'd face that smirking judge. But tonight, she was just a name on a rap sheet, her life shredded thread by thread, Jamal's sobs the soundtrack to her unraveling world. Latoya Harris stumbled into the Crestmont courthouse 3 days after her arrest, the sticky Georgia heat plastering her faded blouse to her back, her wrists still tender from the cuffs that had bitten into her skin. The building loomed like a relic, its chipped columns and scuffed marble floors, reeking of old power and older grudges. She'd barely slept in the county jail, the lumpy cot and buzzing lights grinding her nerves raw, Jamal's tearful face, haunting every restless minute. Mrs. Ellis had called once, her voice crackling through the payphone, promising Jamal was safe, but Latoya's chest ached with every second she couldn't hold him. Today was her arraignment, her first chance to speak, to claw back some shred of her life from the theft accusation that had torched her world. She had no lawyer, no money to hire one, just the USB drive tucked in her pocket and a stubborn flicker of hope that truth might matter here. But as she stepped into the courtroom, a swamp of dread swallowed that flicker whole. The room was a furnace, the ancient ceiling fan creaking uselessly overhead, stirring air thick with sweat and murmurs. Rows of wooden benches sagged under the weight of a packed gallery, all white faces, their eyes boring into her like she was a sideshow act. She caught snatches of their whispers. Stealing from the bank, knew she was trouble, the words laced with a venom she'd felt since moving to this town. Latoya squared her shoulders, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands, and took her place at the defendant's table alone. No one had come with her. No family, no friends able to skip work or brave this lion's den. She clutched the USB drive tighter, its edges digging into her palm, a lifeline she'd wield if they'd let her. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise!" and the shuffle of feet filled the space as Judge Virgil Hensley swept in, his black robe billowing like a vulture's wings. He was a gaunt man, tall and wiry, his silver hair slicked back from a sharp forehead, his pale eyes glinting with something cold and cruel. Latoya's stomach twisted as he settled onto the bench, his gaze locking onto her with a predator's focus. His thin lips curled into a smirk, faint but unmistakable, a look that said he'd already sized her up and found her wanting. The bailiff barked, "Be seated," and the room obeyed, a hushed shuffle settling into an eerie quiet. Latoya's heart hammered, a frantic thud she swore echoed off the walls, drowning out the faint hum of the fan. She told herself to breathe, to stay calm, repeating silently, "I did nothing wrong, I'm innocent." But when Hensley's eyes met hers again, that smirk widened just enough to send ice down her spine, a silent promise that her words wouldn't matter here. The prosecutor, Miles Tate, strode forward, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp grey suit, his blonde hair clipped short, his voice rolling out like thunder. He was Crestmont's golden boy, known for chewing up defendants and spitting out convictions, his reputation a wall Latoya had no hope of scaling. "Your Honor," Tate began, his tone dripping with certainty, "the state charges Latoya Harris with theft and fraud, totaling $20,000 from First Trust Bank. She abused her position as an accountant, siphoning funds from innocent clients over months, a calculated betrayal of trust." He turned to the gallery, playing to their nods and gasps, painting her as a scheming mastermind. Latoya's jaw clenched, her fists balling under the table. Every word was a lie, a brick in a wall built to bury her, and she had no one to knock it down. Hensley leaned forward, tapping a pen against his desk, his smirk now a fixture as Tate laid out the case. "Miss Harris," the judge drawled, his voice slow and syrupy, "how do you plead?" Latoya stood, legs trembling but chin high, her voice cracking as she forced it out. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A ripple of snickers rolled through the gallery, a sound that stung like nettles. But she kept her eyes on Hensley, refusing to flinch. His amusement flickered, a glint in his stare before he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Not guilty, huh? Folks like you always play innocent. Don't you?" The gallery erupted in muffled laughter, a chorus of agreement, and Latoya's face burned, rage simmering beneath her skin. He wasn't just judging her. He was mocking her, stripping her bare before she'd even spoken. Tate stepped up again, holding a sheaf of papers stamped with her login, the same forged evidence Carver had waved in her face. "We've got records, Your Honor. Transaction logs, all tied to her." She thought she could outsmart the system, but we caught her red-handed. Latoya opened her mouth to protest, but Hensley cut her off with a lazy wave. "You'll get your turn, Miss Harris, if you've got anything worth hearing." His tone oozed contempt, a slap dressed as procedure, and she swallowed hard, the USB drive feeling heavier by the second. She wanted to scream it then, to shove her proof in their faces, but Tate barreled on, detailing a crime she'd never touched, every lie tightening the noose around her neck. The hearing dragged, each minute a fresh cut. Tate finished with a flourish, calling her a menace to Crestmont's hard-working folks, and sat smug as Hensley nodded along. "Miss Harris," the judge said, peering down, "you got a lawyer?" She shook her head, throat dry. "No. Your Honor, I can't afford one." His smirk twitched, a flash of teeth. "Pity. Well, let's set bail. $50,000 cash or bond?" Latoya gasped, the number a sledgehammer to her chest. 50,000. She barely had $50 after rent, let alone collateral for a bond. The gallery murmured approval, a low hum of satisfaction, and she sank into her chair, the room spinning. She'd rot in jail, Jamal alone, because of a price tag she couldn't. "Dream of meeting." Hensley banged his gavel, the crack splitting the air, and waved her off. "Take her back, next case." Two court officers grabbed her arms, their grips bruising as they hauled her up. She twisted, catching Hensley's eye one last time, that smirk still plastered across his face, a mask of superiority that branded her guilty before she'd even fought. They marched her through a side door, the gallery's whispers chasing her, thief, trash, a venomous echo. In the hall, a guard waited, a hulking man with a buzz cut and a scowl. As they shoved her toward the holding cell, he spat. At her feet, the glob landing inches from her shoe. "Filthy crook," he growled, the slur beneath his breath slicing deeper than the spit. The cell door clanged shut, a rusted slab locking her in with stale air and flickering lights. Latoya slumped against the wall, the concrete cold through her thin blouse, her mind reeling. $50,000, no lawyer, a judge who'd sneered at her like she was dirt, a prosecutor spinning lies, a town cheering her fall. She'd come, armed with truth, that USB drive her only shield, but they hadn't even let her speak. Jamal was out there scared, maybe crying, and she couldn't reach him. The guard's spit lingered in her mind, a symbol of Crestmont's hate, a town that saw her skin and wrote her fate. She hugged herself, fighting tears, the weight of it all pressing down. How could she climb out of this pit when every hand pushed her deeper? Was this justice or just a game rigged to break her? Comment number 1 if you think Latoya's getting a fair shot here, or if this stinks of something rotten. Hit that like button if you're raging at Hensley's smirk, and subscribe to see if she can turn this nightmare around. Should a single mom like her be crushed this easy, or is there a crack in their wall she can pry open? What happens when she gets a sliver of hope only to watch it burn? Latoya Harris sat on the edge of a sagging cot in the Crestmont County Jail, the air heavy with mildew and the faint tang of bleach, her fingers tracing the USB drive in her pocket like a talisman. 3 nights had passed since Judge Hensley's smirk and that $50,000 bail had locked her in this concrete cage, each hour gnawing at her resolve. Jamal's voice echoed in her head, his sobs from the arrest night, a wound that wouldn't close. She'd managed one call to Mrs. Ellis, the neighbor's gravelly tone reassuring her Jamal was eating, sleeping, but the distance between them stretched like a chasm she couldn't bridge. The cell's flickering bulb buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows on the walls, and she fought the panic clawing up her throat. She had proof, didn't she? That drive held her innocence, timestamps and logs that could unravel this lie. If only someone would listen. The clang of the cell block door jolted her upright, boots echoing down the hall. A guard, the same buzzcut. Brute who'd spat at her feet grunted her name. Harris, phone call. She scrambled up, heart thudding, following him to a dented payphone bolted to the wall. The receiver felt greasy in her hand as she pressed it to her ear, praying it was good news. "Latoya!" The voice was sharp, familiar, cutting through the static. Simone Carter, her college roommate from Atlanta, a firecracker who'd once talked her through a breakdown over finals. "Simone, thank God," Latoya breathed, relief flooding her. "I'm in deep. They're saying I stole $20,000. I can't afford bail. Jamal's with a neighbor. Simone cut in, fierce as ever. "I heard Mrs. Ellis called me. I'm on it, girl. You still got that USB with your work backups?" Latoya nodded, forgetting Simone couldn't see. "Yeah, right here." Simone's next words lit a spark. Good. I dug through some old contacts, found a memo from First Trust Bank. It's buried in their system, but it clears you, says your login was flagged for review weeks ago before the theft hit. I've got a copy. I'm driving down now. Latoya's knees wobbled, hope surging like a tide. You're serious, Simone. That could get me out. The line crackled as Simone laughed, grim but determined. Damn right. I'll be there. By morning. Hang tight. The call ended, the guard yanking her back to the cell, but Latoya barely felt the shove. A memo. Proof she wasn't crazy, wasn't a thief. She sank onto the cot, clutching the drive, a plan forming. If Simone could get that to the court, maybe this nightmare would crack open. Dawn broke sticky and grey, the jail's narrow windows smearing light across the floor. Latoya paced, counting minutes until a different guard hauled her out, muttering, about a hearing. She stumbled into the courthouse, wrists uncuffed but raw, the same sweltering courtroom waiting like a trap. Judge Hensley perched on his bench, silver hair glinting under the lights, that smirk twitching as he spotted her. The gallery was thinner today, but their stares still burned, whispers hissing through the air. Latoya stood alone again, no lawyer, just the USB and a prayer. Then the doors banged open, Simone storming in, her braids swinging, a manila folder clutched tight. Your Honor, she shouted, voice slicing the murmurs, I've got evidence for Latoya Harris. Hensley's eyes narrowed, but he couldn't stop her from shoving the folder at the clerk, a wiry woman who flinched under his glare. Latoya's pulse raced as the clerk handed the memo up. Hensley skimmed it, his jaw tightening, the smirk fading, for a split second. This is irregular, he snapped, voice clipped. Where'd this come from? Simone squared up, unflinching. First Trust's own system flagged her login as compromised before any money went missing. She's no thief and you've got no case. Latoya stepped forward, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I've got backups too, Your Honor. On this drive, every file I worked on, none of those transactions are mine. She held it out, the clerk snatching it reluctantly. Hensley leaned back, tapping his pen, a storm brewing behind his pale eyes. The gallery shifted, murmurs, growing, and Latoya felt a flicker of triumph. He couldn't ignore this, could he? Minutes dragged, thick with tension, as Hensley flipped through the memo, lips pursed. Tate, the prosecutor, leaped up, red-faced. This is unverified, Your Honor. A stunt to delay justice. But the judge raised a hand, silencing him, his smirk replaced by a scowl. I'll review it, he growled, but don't think this changes much. Latoya's heart sank, then soared as he added, bail's revoked pending a full hearing. Release her. The gavel slammed, a reluctant thud, and the room buzzed. Latoya turned to Simone, tears pricking her eyes, and they hugged, fierce and quick. By noon she walked out, free air hitting her lungs, the USB back in her pocket. She raced to Mrs. Ellis's, scooping Jamal into her arms, his small body trembling against hers as he whispered, Mama, you're back. For an hour, she let herself breathe. Sitting on her sagging couch, Jamal curled beside her, the TV droning some cartoon he loved. The memo had worked. Simone's bull-headed push had cracked the cage. She could fight this, clear her name for good. But as dusk painted the sky orange, tires screeched outside, a harsh squeal that snapped her upright. She peered through the blinds, heart lurching as 3 pickup trucks roared up, headlights blinding. Masked figures spilled out, hoods pulled low, their shouts muffled but venomous. Before she could move, a bottle smashed through her window, glass exploding across, the floor flames licking up as gasoline ignited. Jamal screamed, and she yanked him back, shielding him as fire clawed at the curtains. She grabbed a blanket, smothering the blaze, coughing through smoke as more bottles crashed, one slamming the door, painting thief in red spray across the wood. The men howled, "Get out, crook!" and peeled away, tires spinning gravel. Latoya stumbled outside, Jamal clinging to her, the air thick with burning oil. Her Honda sat gutted, flames devouring the seats, a charred skeleton in minutes. Neighbors watched from shadows, silent, no one calling for help. A folded note lay in the grass, singed but readable. Stay quiet. She clutched Jamal tighter, his sobs soaking her shirt, rage boiling under her fear. Cops arrived late. 2 officers strolling up, one smirking as he kicked a shard of glass. "Shouldn't mess with the wrong people," he said, shrugging. "Looks like an accident to me." LaToya stared at the wreckage, her car a smoldering ruin, her door defaced, that note a dagger in her gut. The cops scribbled a half-hearted report and left, their taillights fading into the humid night. She'd thought freedom was hers, that the memo had loosened the noose. But this was a warning, a fist from the dark, and she knew Hensley's shadow loomed behind it. Jamal shivered beside her, asking, "Why'd they do that, Mama?" She had no answer, just held him, the acrid stench of smoke choking her hope. Someone wanted her silent, scared, and they'd burned her world to prove it. She glanced at the USB still safe in her pocket and wondered if truth was worth this price. LaToya Harris stood in the smoky haze outside her Crestmont apartment, the charred husk of her Honda still ticking with heat, the red scrawl of thief glaring from her door like a fresh wound. Jamal clung to her waist, his small frame shaking, his whimpers cutting through the humid night, as neighbors watched from cracked blinds, their silence louder than the sirens that never came. The cops had shrugged off the arson, their smirks a slap, and that singed note, "Stay quiet," burned in her mind, a threat she couldn't unsee. She'd barely slept, curling around Jamal on the couch, the shattered window, letting in a sticky breeze that carried the stench of gasoline. Morning broke grey and heavy, the town waking to a story that wasn't hers. By 8, the local news blared it, "Black thief freed on technicality." The headline twisted her gut, a lie spun from the memo that had sprung her, now a noose, tightening around her life. She flipped on the TV, hoping for clarity, but the anchor's voice dripped with disdain. LaToya Harris, accused of stealing $20,000 from First Trust Bank, walked free yesterday, after a last-minute document raised doubts. Some call it justice, others a loophole for a criminal. The screen cut to a grainy shot of her leaving the courthouse, Jamal's face blurred beside her, the gallery's jeers audible in the background. LaToya's stomach lurched, her hands trembling as she muted it, but the damage was done. Her phone buzzed, a text from Simone. "Check outside." She peered through the blinds, heart sinking as a crowd gathered on the patchy lawn, white faces twisted with rage, their shouts rising like a storm. "Thief! Go back where you came from!" Rocks thudded against the walls, one smashing, through the already broken window, glass spraying across the floor. Jamal yelped, diving behind her, and she yanked him down, shielding his head as the mob's roar grew feral. LaToya's breath came fast, panic clawing her chest as she peeked out again. They held signs. "Justice for Crestmont. No crooks." Here the words of veneer for the slurs they spat. "Dirty leech bankrat." Each one a blade aimed at her skin. She grabbed Jamal, whispering, "Stay low, baby," and crawled to the kitchen, fumbling for her phone. She dialed 911, voice shaking as she begged, "Please, they're attacking my home. My son's here." The dispatcher's drawl was ice. "We'll send someone when we can." The line clicked dead, and another rock crashed through, splintering the table. LaToya clutched Jamal tighter, his tears soaking her shirt, her mind racing. This wasn't just anger, it was a lynching without the rope, and no one was coming to stop it. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the mob's chants a relentless drumbeat, until a figure darted through the chaos, a black man in a faded jacket, his face taut with urgency. He banged on the door, voice low but firm. "LaToya, it's Marcus! Open up, quick!" She hesitated, then unbolted it, pulling him inside as a bottle smashed behind him. Marcus Jones, a local activist she'd met once at a community meeting, locked the door, his eyes scanning the room. "Saw the news, knew they'd come for you, we gotta move." LaToya nodded, grabbing Jamal's backpack, stuffing in clothes and the USB drive, her hands shaking as Marcus peeked out. "They're Hensley's people," he said, voice grim. "He's got a history, targeting folks like us, framing 'em, breaking 'em. You're not the first." She froze, the name Hensley a jolt. "The judge? You're saying he sent them?" Marcus nodded, pulling her toward the back door. "He's got pull, runs this town like his plantation. That memo pissed him off, and this is payback." He led them out, ducking through an alley as shouts echoed, rocks pelting the apartment's rear. LaToya clutched Jamal's hand, his sneakers scuffing the gravel, her pulse hammering as they slipped into Marcus's rusted pickup. He gunned it, weaving through back streets, the mob's roar fading but not her fear. They stopped at a dingy safe house, a shack tucked behind overgrown pines, its windows boarded. Inside, Marcus handed her a stack of papers, bank files he'd swiped. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a log. "Your login was hacked, used after hours. Someone inside set you up." LaToya's eyes widened, scanning the timestamps, her name stamped on moves she'd never made. "This proves it," she whispered, hope flickering. "I can take this to Carver. Make him admit it's a lie." Marcus frowned, but she was already moving, adrenaline surging. She left Jamal with him, promising to be quick, and drove his truck to First Trust, the squat building looming under a bruised sky. She stormed in, past Darren's sneer, straight to Carver's office. He looked up, sweat beading on his forehead, and she slapped the papers down. "My login was hacked. You know I didn't steal a dime. Call this off or I go public." Carver leaned back, a slow, mocking laugh rumbling out. "Prove it, girl. You think anyone cares about your little stack? You're done here." She stood there, fists clenched, his dismissal a punch to her gut. He waved her off, turning to his computer like she was nothing, and she backed out, rage simmering. The drive back to the safe house was a blur, Carver's laugh looping in her head, but worse waited. She pulled up as dusk fell, stepping out to find Marcus pacing, his face tight. "Jamal's school called," he said, voice low. "They expelled him." "Safety concerns," they said, "but it's bullshit. Hensley's flexing, hitting you where it hurts." LaToya's knees buckled, the air rushing out of her. Expelled? Jamal, her bright boy who loved math, kicked out because of her? She sank. Onto the shack steps, the papers slipping from her hand, the town's hate closing in like a vice. Inside, Jamal sat on a cot, coloring with a stubby crayon, oblivious to the axe that had just fallen. "Mama, when can I go back to school?" he asked, eyes big and trusting. She forced a smile, throat tight. "Soon, baby. We'll fix it." But the lie tasted bitter, the weight of Crestmont's rejection crushing her. The news had turned her into a pariah. The mob had torched her home, and now her son's future was ash too. Marcus sat beside her, voice soft. "They won't stop, LaToya. Hensley's got the bank, the cops, the whole damn town. You're a threat now." She nodded, staring at the hacked logs, proof that meant nothing to a world that had already judged her. The night deepened, cicadas droning outside, and LaToya hugged Jamal close, his breathing steady against her chest. She'd thought the memo was her lifeline, but it had lit a fuse instead. Carver's laugh, the mob's rocks, Jamal's expulsion. They were pieces of a machine grinding her down, a machine with Hensley at the helm. She traced the USB drive in her pocket, its edges worn from her grip, and wondered if fighting was just feeding the beast. The town had turned its back, every door slamming shut, and she was a ghost in a place she'd tried to call home. How much more could they take from her before she broke? Think LaToya's getting a raw deal from a town that hates her for breathing. Comment number 1 if you agree she's fighting a stacked deck. Hit that like button if you're boiling over. This mob's nerve. And subscribe to see if she can punch back. Should a mom and her kid be hunted like this just for standing up, or is there a spark left to burn this mess down? What happens when she pushes harder, only to lose something she can't replace? LaToya Harris sat on a creaky cot in Marcus's safe house, the shack's pine walls creaking under a humid Crestmont night, the hacked bank logs spread across her lap like a map to salvation. Jamal slept beside her, his small chest rising and falling, a crayon still clutched in his fist, his expulsion from school a fresh scar she couldn't soothe. The TV news had branded her a thief. The mob had torched her car, and Carver's mocking laugh still rang in her ears, but these papers, stolen by Marcus from First Trust, were her lifeline. Her login, used after hours, stamped on transactions. She'd never touched, proof someone inside had framed her. She traced the timestamps with a trembling finger, her mind racing. If she could get this out, show the world, maybe Hensley's grip would slip. She glanced at Marcus, hunched over a laptop in the corner, his jaw tight as he typed. "We go viral," she said, voice firm. Put it online, force their hand. Marcus nodded, his eyes flicking to the screen. Risky, but it could work. If Crestmont sees this, Hensley's got no choice but a new hearing. He uploaded the logs to a local forum, anonymous but loud, attaching a post. First trust frames innocent woman, here's the proof. LaToya held her breath as he hit send, the shack's single bulb flickering overhead, casting jittery shadows. Within hours the post exploded, shares spiking, comments flooding in, some cursing her, others demanding answers. By morning, it hit national blogs, a headline screaming, "Crestmont Bank caught in scandal." Her heart thudded, a wild mix of fear and triumph. She'd done it, cracked the silence, and the world was listening. Marcus grinned, rare and sharp. They can't ignore this now. She dared to hope, clutching Jamal as the safe house's cracked radio buzzed with updates. By noon, a local station reported Judge Hensley had called an emergency hearing, pressure mounting from the viral storm. LaToya, dressed in her last clean skirt, kissed Jamal's forehead and left him with Marcus, promising to be back soon. She walked into the courthouse, the air thick with sweat and tension, the gallery packed tighter than before, their whispers a low growl. Hensley sat high, his silver hair glinting, that smirk replaced by a scowl as he shuffled papers. "Miss Harris," he drawled, voice clipped, "you've stirred quite a mess. Let's see this so-called evidence." She stood, legs steady, and handed the clerk the hacked logs, her voice ringing clear. "These show my login was used when I wasn't even at work. I'm innocent, Your Honor, and someone's hiding the truth." The room buzzed, eyes boring into her, but she held Hensley's gaze, watching his jaw twitch. Tate, the prosecutor, leaped up, red-faced. "This is inadmissible, stolen files, no chain of custody." Hensley raised a hand, silencing him, his pale eyes scanning the logs. Minutes dragged, the fan creaking overhead, until he leaned back, tapping his pen. "Interesting," he muttered, reluctance dripping from every syllable. "Case teeters on this. I'll consider a dismissal, but we need verification. Hearing set for next week." The gavel cracked, and LaToya's chest loosened, a breath she'd held for days rushing out. She'd pushed the needle, tipped. The scales. She walked out, head high, the gallery's murmurs trailing her like smoke. Back at the safe house, she hugged Jamal, his small arms tight around her neck, and Marcus clapped her shoulder. "You did it, LaToya, they're squirming." She smiled, faint but real, letting herself believe it. Maybe the nightmare was cracking, maybe justice wasn't a ghost. She cooked Jamal spaghetti from a dented can, the shack's stove sputtering, and they ate on the cot, laughing at his silly stories. Night fell, cicadas droning outside, and she tucked him in, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Marcus stepped out to grab water, promising to be quick, and she locked the door behind him, the quiet settling like a balm. She'd won a round, hadn't she? The world knew now, and Hensley couldn't bury her so easy. But the quiet shattered with a phone call, the shack's burner buzzing on the table. She answered, voice wary. "Hello?" Silence, then a rasp. "Check outside." The line died, and her stomach dropped, a chill snaking up her spine. She crept to the window, peeling back a board, and froze. Marcus's truck sat under the pines, but he wasn't in it. A shadow moved, then another, and her breath caught as she saw him, sprawled in a ditch across the road, his jacket torn, blood pooling under his head. A scream lodged in her throat as she bolted out, Jamal stirring behind her. "Mama!" She reached Marcus, dropping to her knees, his face battered, eyes staring blank at the sky. A note was pinned to his chest, soaked red. "She's next." LaToya's hands shook, tearing the note free, her mind reeling as tires squealed in the distance, headlights vanishing into the dark. She pressed her fingers to his neck, praying for a pulse, but his skin was cold, his fight gone. "No, no, no," she choked, tears blurring the blood, the note crumpling in her fist. She stumbled back to the shack, slamming the door. Jamal, awake now, crying, "Where's Marcus?" She pulled him close, rocking him, unable to speak the truth. Cops arrived an hour later, slow and casual, their flashlights sweeping the scene. "Random crime," one said. A lanky man with a smirk, kicking dirt over Marcus's blood. "Happens out here." Latoya clutched the note, rage boiling, knowing Hensley's hand was in this, a message carved in her friend's flesh. She called, "Simone," from the burner, voice breaking as she whispered, "They killed Marcus, beat him dead, left a note. It's my fault." Simone cursed, promising to come, but Latoya barely heard, the weight crashing down. The cops left, their report a lie, and Dawn brought worse. Her landlord, a squat man with a permanent sneer, banged on the shack's door, eviction notice in hand. "Troublemaker tenants," he spat, eyeing Jamal. "Out by noon or I call the law." Latoya stared numb, the hacked logs useless now, her win a death sentence. She packed their few things, Jamal's crayons, her USB, into the backpack, Marcus's, blood still staining her hands. Simone arrived, her car rattling up, and helped them load what little they had. "We'll find a motel," she said, voice tight. "This ain't over." Latoya nodded hollow, guiding Jamal into the back seat, his questions unanswered. The shack faded behind them, a tomb for Marcus's fight, and they checked into a roadside motel, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Latoya sank onto a lumpy mattress, Jamal curling beside her, the note's words searing her mind. She's next. She'd thought the viral post was her sword, but it had drawn blood instead, Hensley's retaliation swift and savage. The town wasn't just against her, it was a machine grinding her down, and Marcus had paid the price. She hugged Jamal tighter, his warmth her only anchor, and wondered how much more she could lose before it broke her. Latoya Harris slumped on a lumpy motel bed in Crestmont, the neon sign outside buzzing like a trapped fly, its red glow bleeding through thin curtains to paint the room in flickers of hell. Jamal slept fitfully beside her, his small body curled tight, his face still streaked with tears from Marcus's death, a loss she couldn't explain to him yet. The motel smelled of stale smoke and mildew, a far cry from the safe house they'd fled, but it was all Simone could scrape together after the landlord's eviction notice had chased them out. Latoya's hands still trembled, Marcus's blood. Crusted under her nails, the note, "She's next," crumpled in her pocket, its threat a heartbeat in her skull. The viral post had backfired, her proof of innocence turning Marcus into a corpse, and now she was a ghost in her own life, hunted by a town that wanted her broken. She clutched the USB drive, its edges worn smooth from her grip, and stared at the ceiling, cracks spidering across it like her fracturing resolve. Simone paced the room, her braids swinging, her voice a low growl. "We can't sit here, Latoya. Hensley's not stopping and the cops are his dogs. We need someone louder, someone they can't touch." Latoya nodded, exhaustion warring with rage, Marcus's blank eyes flashing in her mind. She'd lost her job, her home, her friend, and now Jamal's school, all because she'd dared to fight. But giving up wasn't in her. "A reporter," she said, sitting up, the idea sparking. "Someone who'll blast this wide open." Simone snapped her fingers, eyes lighting. "Elise Tanner. Rogue journo, works the Atlanta beat, loves a corrupt judge story. I've got her number." Latoya's pulse quickened, a lifeline in the dark. "Call her. Now." Simone dialed, the phone's tinny ring filling the room, and Elise picked up, her voice sharp and smoky. "Tanner, who's this?" Simone laid it out, fast and fierce. Latoya's framing, the hacked logs, Marcus's murder, Hensley's shadow. Elise listened, silent, then cut in. "Crestmont, huh? Heard whispers about that judge. I'm in. Meet me tomorrow. First Trust's gala. Pierce, the CEO, will be there. We'll catch him dirty." Latoya's stomach flipped. Roland Pierce's name a jolt. The bank's head, a man she'd seen only in memos, now a puppet master in her nightmare. She agreed, voice steady. "We'll be there." The call ended and she hugged Jamal closer, his warmth stealing her. This was her shot, a desperate swing at the beast. Next evening, Latoya slipped into a borrowed black dress from Simone, its hem frayed but passable, her heart pounding as they drove to the Crestmont Country Club. The gala glittered under chandeliers, a sea of white faces in suits and gowns, champagne flutes clinking over the hum of privilege. Elise met them at the edge, a wiry woman with cropped red hair and a recorder tucked in her clutch, her green eyes glinting with hunger. "Stick close," she whispered, nodding toward Pierce, a barrel-chested man with slicked-back grey hair, holding court near the bar. Latoya's skin prickled as they edged nearer, Elise's phone discreetly rolling audio. Pierce's voice boomed, slurred with liquor, as he bragged to a knot of suits. Cleaned up some trash at the bank. Pinned. Saw it neat. That Harris girl, dumb as dirt, took the full perfect. Latoya's fists clenched, nails biting her palms, rage roaring through her veins. Elise nudged her, whispering, "Got it," and they slipped back, hearts racing as they ducked into a corner. The recorder clicked off. Pierce's words a smoking gun, and Latoya felt a surge of triumph, fierce and bright. "That's it," she breathed, eyes locked on Elise. "Air it. Tonight." Elise grinned, feral, and uploaded the clip to her outlet's site, a local station picking it up within hours. By midnight, the news hit. Bank CEO admits framing employee in shocking. Audio. Crestmont buzzed, outrage swelling online, protests brewing outside First Trust. Latoya watched from the motel, Jamal asleep beside her, a smile tugging her lips. She'd hit them hard, exposed Pierce, and Hensley couldn't dodge this. Morning broke with a roar, the clip viral, calls for Pierce's head echoing across Georgia. Latoya dared to believe it, the tide turning, her name clearing in the chaos. She let Jamal watch cartoons, his laughter a balm, and stepped outside, to breathe. The humid air thick but sweeter now. Maybe she'd won. Maybe this was the crack that'd bring Hensley down. But as noon crept in, a black SUV rolled up, tires crunching gravel, and two women in stiff blazers climbed out, badges, flashing Child Protective Services. "Latoya Harris," one said, voice flat. "We're taking Jamal, reports of an unfit environment, danger to the child." Latoya's world tilted, her scream ripping free as they pushed past, grabbing Jamal from the bed, his wails piercing the air. "No, he's mine, you can't." She clawed at the car door as they shoved him in, his small hands banging the window. "Mama!" The SUV peeled out, dust choking her as she sank to her knees, sobs tearing her chest. Simone ran up, cursing. But it was done, Jamal gone, stolen by a system that didn't flinch. Hours later, Hensley's voice crackled on the radio, an emergency hearing set. Latoya staggered into the courthouse, eyes red, hands empty. The gallery hushed as she faced him. He smirked again, that cruel curlback, and banged his gavel. "Custody denied, Miss Harris. State's got your boy till we sort this mess." His words were a blade, slicing her last tether, and she stumbled out. The USB drive useless now, Pierce's confession a hollow win. She'd struck back, shaken their throne, but they'd ripped her heart out in return, Jamal's cries echoing in her skull. Simone dragged her to a diner, forcing coffee into her hands, but Latoya barely felt it, the world a blur of rage and grief. "They're monsters," she whispered, voice raw. "Pierce bragged and Hensley took my son." Simone gripped her arm, fierce. "We'll get him back. That audio's still out there, burning them." Latoya nodded, hollow. The fight, draining from her bones. She'd thought exposing Pierce would free her, but it had tightened the noose. Hensley's retaliation swift and personal. The motel loomed as they returned, its neon flickering like a dying star, and she sank onto the bed, Jamal's absence a void swallowing her whole. She'd punched up, drawn blood, but the beast had claws and it knew where to strike. Was Latoya's bold move worth this gut punch? Comment number 1 if you think she deserved better than losing Jamal for fighting back. Smash that like button. If Pierce's smug confession has you fuming, and subscribe to see if she can claw her way out. Can a mom's love survive a system this twisted? Or did she just hand Hensley the win he craved? What happens when she finds new allies, only to watch them bleed too? Latoya Harris sat on the edge of a sagging couch in a Crestmont safehouse, a crumbling duplex hidden behind overgrown kudzu, the air thick with dust and the faint reek of mold. Her hands shook, coffee cold in a chipped mug, her eyes hollow from a night of sobs after CPS tore Jamal from her arms, his screams still echoing in her skull. The motel had become a trap, so Simone had dragged her here, a last-ditch refuge from Hensley's reach. Pierce's recorded confession had gone viral, shaking Crestmont's foundations, but the cost was her son, stolen by a system that smirked as it struck. She clutched the USB drive, its edges worn to a dull shine. her mind a storm of rage and despair. She'd exposed Pierce, thought she'd won, but Hensley had countered with a blow she couldn't dodge, leaving her broken, teetering on surrender. Simone paced the creaky floor, her boots thudding, her voice a lifeline in the dark. "We're not done, LaToya. That audio's still burning them, and we've got people listening now." LaToya nodded, numb, her throat raw from crying. "They've got Jamal," she whispered, the words a wound. "What's left to fight for?" Before Simone could answer, the door creaked open, and Elise Tanner slipped in, her red hair damp with sweat, a laptop under her arm. "Got someone," she said, voice low, setting the machine on a rickety table. "Carla Ruiz, ex-teller at First Trust. She's ready to talk." LaToya's head snapped up, a flicker of hope piercing the fog. "About what?" Elise grinned, sharp and fierce. "Everything." Carla arrived an hour later, a wiry woman with dark eyes and a nervous tic, her hands twisting a frayed scarf as she perched on a stool. "I worked the counter 3 years," she said, voice trembling. "Saw Pierce move money, millions through shell accounts, when folks noticed he'd frame black employees, low-level like you, LaToya, made 'em take the fall to hide his dirt." LaToya's breath caught, the pieces clicking. "He framed me for 20,000, but there's more?" Carla nodded, pulling a USB from her bag, identical to LaToya's. "Ledgers, emails, proof he's been at it for years. I copied it before I quit." LaToya's pulse raced, rage reigniting. "Why now?" Carla swallowed, eyes darting. "Marcus, heard he died for this. Couldn't stay quiet no more." The room buzzed with tension as Elise plugged Carla's drive. Into the laptop, files spilling across the screen. Transactions, memos, Pierce's signature on orders to falsify logs. One email, dated a month back, chilled LaToya's blood. "Harris is perfect. No one will question it. Pin the 20 and move on." She gripped the table, knuckles whitening. "This is it," she said, voice steady despite the storm inside. "We send this to the FBI, blow it wide open." Simone frowned, cautious. "They'll come for us harder." LaToya met her eyes, fierce. "They've got my son. Harder's all I've got left." Elise nodded, typing fast, encrypting the files. "Atlanta field office, sending now." The upload ticked by, agonizingly slow, the safe house's weak signal stuttering under the weight. LaToya paced, Carla fidgeting, Simone guarding the door with a baseball bat from the closet. "Sent," Elise finally said, slamming the laptop shut, a grin breaking through. "FBI's got it. Pierce and Hensley can't bury this." LaToya's chest loosened, a breath she'd held since Jamal's cries rushing out. She imagined agents storming First Trust. Hensley's smirk wiped clean, Jamal back in her arms. "We did it," she whispered, turning to Carla, who managed a shaky smile. "For Marcus," Carla said, and LaToya nodded, tears pricking her eyes. For Marcus, for Jamal, for every piece they'd ripped from her. The moment shattered with a thud, the front door rattling, then splintering as black-clad figures burst in, rifles raised, shouting, "Police, hands up!" LaToya froze, heart slamming her ribs. Jamal's name a scream in her throat as she dropped to her knees, hands high. Simone swung the bat, but a cop tackled her, pinning her to the floor, her curses muffled. Elise lunged for the laptop, but a gloved hand snatched it, smashing it against the wall, circuits sparking. Carla shrieked, scrambling back, and a shot rang out, sharp and final. LaToya's head whipped around, blood pooling under Carla's chest, her scarf soaking red as she slumped, eyes wide and still. "No!" LaToya yelled, lunging, but a boot slammed her down, her cheek grinding into the gritty floor. "Hostage crisis," a cop barked into a radio, his voice cold, rehearsed. "Suspect shot one, we neutralized her." LaToya's mind reeled, the lie a sledgehammer. Hostage crisis? Carla was no threat, just a whistleblower with a truth too. Big. The SWAT team moved fast, cuffing Simone, dragging her out as she spat, "You bastards!" LaToya twisted, kicking, screaming. She didn't do anything. A rifle butt cracked her shoulder, pain exploding, and she went limp, vision blurring. Through the haze, she saw them haul Carla's body away, blood streaking the floor, the USB drive kicked into a corner. A cop grinned, buzz-cut familiar, the same one who'd spat at her in jail. "Should have stayed quiet," he sneered, yanking. "Her up." They shoved her out. the night air biting her skin, sirens wailing as neighbors peeked from shadows, phones raised but useless. Simone was gone, stuffed in a van, and LaToya stumbled, uncuffed, the cops barking, "Move!" She bolted, legs burning, ducking into an alley as tires screeched behind her. Her shoulder throbbed, Carla's blood sticky on her hands. The safe house. A tomb now. She hid behind a dumpster, chest heaving, the SWAT raid a blur of death and lies. A false tip, she realized, Hensley's doing, Pierce's muscle flexing through the law. The FBI had the files, but at what cost? Carla dead. Simone. Arrested, her proof smashed. She was a fugitive now, hunted, the taste of victory ash in her mouth. LaToya crouched, the alley's damp concrete seeping through her jeans, her breath ragged as she fished the crumpled note from her pocket. She's next. It wasn't a warning anymore, it was a promise, and she'd walked right into it. The FBI might move, but Hensley's reach was faster, his retaliation a bullet through Carla's heart. She wiped her hands, blood smearing, and gripped the USB drive, her last shard of fight. Simone's voice echoed, "We'll get him back." But Jamal felt further away than ever, the system a beast that ate her allies alive. She staggered up, shadows swallowing her, a hunted woman with nothing left to lose but the fire in her gut. LaToya Harris stumbled through the Georgia backwoods outside Crestmont, the night swallowing her whole, her sneakers sinking into damp earth as thorns snagged her jeans. Her shoulder throbbed from the SWAT rifle butt, a dull ache pulsing with every step. Carla's blood still tacky on her hands, a stain she couldn't scrub away. The alley escape had bought her minutes, not miles, and now she was a fugitive, the buzz of sirens fading, but the hunt alive in her bones. Jamal's face haunted her, his cries from the CPS car blending with Carla's dying gasp, a chorus of loss driving her forward. She clutched the USB drive, her last weapon, its edges biting her palm. The FBI files sent, but useless if she couldn't breathe long enough to see them strike. Hunger gnawed her gut, 3 days since a real meal, her body running on fumes, and fury. She pushed through pines, their needles prickling her arms, the air thick with moss and the hum of crickets, a deceptive calm masking the danger at her heels. Hensley's reach had turned the safe house into a slaughter pen, Carla's bullet a message, Simone's arrest a chain, and now LaToya was prey in a game she'd never wanted to play. The viral audio, the hacked logs, the FBI tip, they'd lit. Hay fire, but it was burning her alive, not them. She tripped over a root, crashing to her knees, breath ragged, and forced herself up, the note's words, "She's next," a whip cracking her resolve. She wouldn't break, not yet, not while Jamal needed her, not while Pierce and Hensley still smirked. Dawn bled through the trees, a sickly grey washing the woods, and LaToya's legs buckled, exhaustion pinning her to a stump. She hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, just ran, the taste of Carla's death sour in her mouth. A stream gurgled nearby and she crawled to it, splashing cold water on her face, gulping it down until her stomach cramped. She needed a move, something bold, something to keep the fight alive. A library, she thought, a public one, computers open to anyone. If she could send the files again, blast them wider, maybe the FBI would move faster. Maybe Hensley's walls would crack. She staggered up, mapping Crestmont in her head. The old brick library downtown her target, a half-day's trek if she didn't collapse first. The sun climbed, humidity cloaking her in sweat, her blouse sticking to her skin as she skirted fields and back roads, dodging every rustle, every shadow. By noon she reached the town's edge, Crestmont's sleepy sprawl mocking her with its quiet streets and white picket fences. She slipped into the library through a side door, its cool air a shock, the hum of fluorescent lights steady overhead. A row of ancient computers sat empty, and she dropped into a chair, hands shaking as she plugged in the USB. The files loaded, slower than her racing pulse, and she emailed them again, to the FBI's Atlanta office. Then every news outlet she could Google, CNN, MSNBC, local stations, anyone who'd bite. Crestmont corruption. Proof inside, she typed, hitting send as her vision blurred, hunger clawing deeper. The emails flew out, a digital hailstorm, and within hours, screens across Georgia lit up. National headlines screamed, "Bank CEO and judge implicated in frame-up scandal." The hacked logs plastered online. Pierce's name in bold, Hensley's tied tight. LaToya watched from the library, a ghost in a corner, as patrons whispered, phones buzzing with the story. Her chest swelled, a flicker of triumph cutting through the haze. She'd done it again, louder this time, the world roaring her truth. A news ticker flashed. Judge Hensley orders new hearing amid outrage. She exhaled, shaky, thinking maybe this was it. Maybe she could surrender, face the court with the nation watching and win Jamal back. She slipped out, heading to a payphone, ready to turn herself in, trusting the tide had turned. The courthouse loomed as she approached. Dusk, painting it gold, her legs leaden but her spine straight. She dialed Simone's burner from memory, voice low. "It's me, I sent it all, they're reopening the case, I'm going in." Simone's reply crackled, urgent. "Wait, LaToya, something's off." But she hung up, stepping inside. Hands raised as cops swarmed, cuffs snapping tight. "LaToya Harris, you're under arrest," one barked, a new charge. "Obstruction, evidence tampering." She didn't fight, trusting the headlines, the hearing set for dawn. Hensley glared from his bench, scowl deep, but she stood tall, thinking justice was close, her surrender a step to Jamal. Hours later, locked in a cell, her burner buzzed, slipped to her by a guard who'd smirked less than the rest. She answered, Simone's voice a hiss. "They've got Jamal." LaToya's heart stopped, the air sucked from her lungs. "What?" Simone choked. "Pierce's men, not CPS, kidnapped him from foster care, sent a photo to my phone. He's gagged, gun to his head. Text says, 'Drop it or he dies.'" LaToya's knees buckled, the phone slipping, a scream clawing her throat. As the image burned in her mind, Jamal, her baby, terrified, a barrel at his temple. Hensley's voice slithered from the courtroom speaker. An emergency adjournment announced, his smirk audible in the delay. She sank against the bars, the cell spinning, her victory a trap sprung shut. She pounded the metal, knuckles splitting, rage and terror warring in her chest. She'd flooded the world with proof, forced a hearing, thought she'd cornered them. But Pierce had reached beyond the law, snatched her son to gag her fight. The guard snatched the phone, smirking now, and left her caged. Jamal's fate, a noose she couldn't cut. She'd run, starved, bled to expose them, and they'd turned her weapon into his chains. The headlines blared outside, but inside she was a mother unraveling, the USB drive useless, her surrender a gift to Hensley's game. She hugged herself, rocking, Carla's death a shadow, Jamal's life the stakes, and wondered if fighting had damned them both. Think LaToya's paying too high a price for the truth? Comment number 1 if you're gutted she's a fugitive still losing everything. Slam that like button if Pierce's kidnapping twist has you spitting mad, and subscribe to see if she can save Jamal from this hell. Is a mum's fight worth it? When the system's this rotten? Or did she just sign his death warrant? What happens when she trades silence for his life, only to face a strike no one saw coming? LaToya Harris sat shackled in a Crestmont jail cell, the concrete walls sweating in the humid dark, her wrists chafed raw by cuffs that clinked with every tremble. Jamal's gagged face, a gun pressed to his temple, seared her mind. The photo Simone had described a blade twisting in her gut. The burner phone was gone, snatched by the sneering guard, leaving her caged and helpless after Pierce's men had kidnapped her son from foster care. Their text, "Drop it or he dies," a noose she couldn't shake. She'd surrendered to force Hensley's hand, the viral files and headlines her leverage, but now her boy was bait, her fight a trap sprung shut. Her shoulder throbbed from the SWAT blow, Carla's blood still flaked on her knuckles, and she rocked against the bars, a low moan escaping her lips, the weight of every loss, Marcus, Jamal, her life, crushing her into the filth. A shadow moved. In the hall, the buzz-cut guard looming, his smirk a flicker under the dim bulb. "Got a deal," he grunted, tossing a folded paper through the bars. She snatched it, hands shaking, unfolding a scrawl. "Meet at warehouse midnight. Silence for the kid. Come alone." Her breath hitched, rage and relief warring in her chest. Pierce's goons, offering a trade, her surrender for Jamal's life. She nodded, voice hoarse. "Tell him I'll be there." The guard shrugged, ambling off, and she sank back, clutching the note, the USB drive heavy in her pocket. She'd exposed them, flooded the world with proof, but they'd hit her where it hurt most, and she'd trade it all. Truth, justice, her fight to feel Jamal's arms again. The clock ticked toward midnight, each second a hammer on her nerves, until the guard returned, uncuffing her with a grunt. "Move fast, princess," she stumbled out, legs weak, the jail's iron door clanging shut behind her. Simone was gone. Elise, too. No one left to guide her, just a mother's instinct pulling her through Crestmont's sticky night. She hitched a ride with a trucker, his rig rattling to the industrial edge of town, dropping her near a sprawl of rusting warehouses, their hulks black against a moonless sky. Her sneakers crunched gravel as she crept to the meet. A sagging building, with broken windows, the air thick with oil and rot. Two figures waited, masked, one holding a phone, the other a gun. "Harris?" one barked, voice muffled. She nodded, hands up, heart slamming her ribs. "Where's my son?" The gunman jerked. His head and a side door creaked open. Jamal staggering out, gag loose, eyes wide with terror. "Mama!" he cried, running to her, and she dropped, scooping him into her arms, his small body trembling against hers as she sobbed into his hair, his bubblegum scent cutting through the stench. "I've got you, baby," she whispered, tears soaking his shirt, relief flooding her veins. The phone guy stepped forward, voice cold. "No more leaks, no more stunts, or we find him again. Clear." She nodded, clutching Jamal tighter, her fight draining into the dirt. "Clear." They backed off, vanishing into shadows, tires squealing as a van peeled out, leaving her kneeling, Jamal's heartbeat her only anchor. She stood, legs shaky, and led him away, every step a prayer they'd keep their word. The trucker was gone, so she walked, Jamal's hand in hers, his questions soft but unanswered. "Why'd they take me, Mama?" She had no words, just squeezed his fingers, guiding him through back roads to a shack she'd spotted days ago, a rotting hideout off the grid. Inside, she barred the door with a plank, the single room bare but safe, a cot and a cracked sink, all it offered. Jamal curled beside her, exhaustion claiming him fast, his breathing steady as she stroked his hair, tears slipping free. She'd traded silence for his life, thought it was over. The nightmare paused. She let herself breathe, the USB drive still. In her pocket, a ember she'd buried to hold him again. Sleep tugged at her, but a hum broke the quiet, faint at first, then louder, a mechanical whine slicing the night. She jolted up, peering through a splintered board, and froze as a black shape hovered outside. A drone, its red eye blinking, rotors slicing the air. Before she could scream, it fired, a missile streaking through the window, exploding in a fireball that swallowed the shack. Flames roared, wood splintering, and Latoya threw herself over Jamal, dragging him from the cot as the roof buckled, heat searing her back. She kicked the door, stumbling out, Jamal coughing in her arms, the blast's echo ringing in her skull. The shack collapsed, a pyre lighting the woods, and she ran. Burns blistering her skin, his weight slowing her as she dodged embers raining down. They hit a ditch, tumbling in, her arms shielding him as the drone buzzed off, its hum fading into the crackle of fire. Jamal whimpered, blood trickling from a cut on his brow, her own hands raw and singed, but alive. Both alive. She held him, rocking, the shack's glow a beacon in the dark, her mind reeling. Pierce hadn't stopped, Hensley's claws sharper than she'd dreamed, a military strike to bury her silence. Sirens wailed closer, and cops swarmed, flashlights, cutting the haze, their shouts harsh. "Latoya Harris, you're under arrest," one yelled, a new face, his badge glinting as they yanked her up, cuffs snapping tight. "Arson?" he spat, nodding at the blaze. "Torched it for sympathy, huh?" She struggled, screaming, "It was a drone, they tried to kill us." But they shoved her into a squad car. Jamal pulled from her grip, his cries piercing the night, as another took him for his safety. The door slammed, the window framing Hensley's voice on a radio, calm and smug. "Suspect apprehended after violent act. Case closed." Latoya pounded the glass, knuckles bleeding, the lie a sledgehammer. She'd traded her fight, gotten Jamal back only for Pierce to burn it all. Hensley pinning the ashes on her. The car lurched, jail looming again, and she sank back, burns stinging, Jamal's fate a fog beyond the bars. In the cell, she curled on the floor, the stench of soot and blood choking her, the drone's whine looping in her ears. She'd thought, silence would save him, but they'd struck anyway. A blow so wild it defied reason, a message she couldn't outrun. The USB drive was gone, lost in the rubble, her proof torched with the shack, and now she was the villain, arsonist in their script. Jamal was out there, hurt, maybe believing she'd failed him, and she clawed the concrete, a howl building in her chest. She'd hit her breaking point, the system a beast that ate her whole, and yet her heart still beat, a faint pulse of fight she couldn't kill. LaToya Harris slumped on the floor of a Crestmont jail cell, the air rancid with sweat and soot, her skin blistered from the drone strike that had torched the shack, her hands raw and crusted with blood. The cuffs bit her wrists, her burns untreated, seeping through her torn blouse as she rocked, Jamal's cries from the cop's grasp looping in her skull. She'd traded silence for his life, held him close, only for Pierce's machine to firebomb their refuge, Hensley pinning the blaze on, her with a smirk she could feel through the walls. Arson, they'd said, hauling her back, ripping Jamal away again, his small body thrashing as they drove off, leaving her caged, spirit cracked, but not dead. The USB drive was ash now, lost in the rubble, her proof gone, and she clawed. The concrete, a low moan escaping her lips, the breaking point a cliff she teetered on but wouldn't fall. Footsteps echoed, sharp and slow, and a guard loomed, a wiry man with a pinched face, less smug than the rest. He slid a burner phone through the bars, its screen cracked but glowing, his voice a mutter. FBI's coming. LaToya snatched it, heart slamming her ribs, the words a jolt through the haze. She pressed it to her ear, static crackling. Then, a voice low and steady. Harris, Agent Tyrone Brooks, Atlanta Field Office. We got your emails, the files, we're moving. Her breath hitched, relief warring with dread. They've got my son, she rasped. Kidnapped him. Bombed us. I'm locked up for it now. Brooks paused, then said, Hang on, we're raiding Pierce's place and stay alive. The line died, the guard melting back into shadows, and she clutched the phone, a lifeline she couldn't trust yet. Across town, Tyrone Brooks, a broad-shouldered black man with close-cropped hair and a jaw set like steel, stood in a dimly lit office, papers strewn across a desk, the hum of a printer spitting evidence. He'd traced LaToya's hacked logs, Carla's ledgers, every byte she'd sent before the SWAT raid, piecing a web that stank of corruption. Pierce's mansion loomed in his mind, a gaudy sprawl on Crestmont's outskirts, and he'd seen enough. Bank transfers, emails to Hensley, a ledger tying them in knots. He'd pushed the warrant through, his gut screaming this was bigger than one woman's frame-up. His team rolled out, vans cutting through the night, headlights slicing the humid dark as they stormed Pierce's gates, boots thudding on marble floors, drawers yanked open, files seized. LaToya paced the cell, the burner, hidden in her sock, her burns afire under her skin, Brooks's words looping. Raiding Pierce, the FBI moving. She dared to imagine it, agents cuffing that smug bastard, Hensley sweating as his empire cracked. She'd sent the files, starved in the woods, lost Carla, lost Jamal, but maybe it wasn't for nothing. Hours dragged, the jail's buzz a torment, until dawn broke, grey light smearing through a slit window. The guard returned, uncuffing her with a grunt. Charges paused, he said, eyes darting. FBI's call, out. She stumbled up, legs jelly, and walked free. The air outside sharp with dew, her mind racing to Jamal. Simone met her at a gas station, her car rattling up, face tight with worry. Heard the news, she said, hugging LaToya fierce, mindful of her burns. Pierce is nailed, they found ledgers, emails, all of it. Hensley squirming. LaToya's chest loosened, tears pricking as they drove to the hospital. Jamal's last stop after the cops had taken him. She burst in, bandages itching, and found him in a sterile room, his brow bandaged, his small frame dwarfed by a cot. Mama! He cried, arms out, and she ran, scooping him up, sobbing into his hair. his warmth a balm on her shredded soul. "I've got you," she whispered, Burns forgotten, the world shrinking to his heartbeat against hers. They discharged him fast, the nurse muttering about orders, and LaToya clung to him, Simone driving them to a cheap motel, its neon flickering like a dying pulse. She let herself breathe, Jamal coloring on the bed, his crayons a splash of normalcy she'd killed to keep. The TV blared. FBI raids bank CEO's home, ties to judge uncovered. And she smiled, faint but real, thinking Brooks had delivered, the beast bleeding at last. She tucked Jamal in, his eyes heavy, and stepped outside, the humid night wrapping her like a cloak. She'd won a round, hadn't she? Pierce cornered, Hensley exposed, Jamal back. She leaned on the railing, Burns stinging but bearable, daring to hope the fight was tipping her way. The quiet shattered with a boom. A blast that shook the ground, glass exploding from the hospital 2 miles off, flames licking the sky. LaToya's heart stopped, her screams swallowed by the roar as smoke billowed, sirens wailing in its wake. She bolted inside, Jamal stirring. "Mama, what's that?" She grabbed the TV remote, flipping channels, her hands shaking as news cut in. Crestmont General bombed. Dozens hurt. The anchor's voice trembled. Suspected retaliation. Sources say Judge Hensley's allies linked. LaToya sank. To her knees, the room spinning. Jamal's name a prayer on her lips. She'd left him there hours ago, safe, she'd thought, but now... The nurse's rushed discharge replayed, a chill snaking up her spine. She dialed Brooks from the burner, voice cracking. "The hospital, Jamal was there, where is he?" Static hissed, then his tone grim. "We're checking, LaToya, bombings fresh, chaos everywhere. Pierce's crew, maybe Hensley's hitting back, stay put." The line died, and she clutched Jamal tighter, his small body trembling, her mind racing. Missing in the chaos, presumed dead, the anchor had said, but he was here, wasn't he? She checked his face, his bandaged brow, his breath warm against her neck, and sobbed, relief warring, with terror. Hensley's allies had bombed a hospital, a strike so wild it defied sanity, and Jamal had dodged it by minutes, a fluke she couldn't grasp. She rocked him, howling into the dark, the motel's walls thin as her hope. "My fault," she choked, guilt clawing her chest. She'd pushed the FBI, exposed Pierce, and they'd answered with fire, not caring who burned. Brooks was out there, raiding, fighting, but the beast was thrashing, its claws slashing blind. Jamal whimpered, "Mama, I'm scared," and she held him closer, burns flaring, her spirit a thread stretched to snap. The TV looped footage, rubble, and screams, and she saw Hensley's smirk in every flame, a promise he'd never stop. She'd sprung free, reunited with Jamal, only to lose him to chaos she couldn't outrun, the fight a pyre consuming all she loved. LaToya Harris sat unhinged in a Crestmont motel room, the air thick with the hum of a dying neon sign, her blistered hands clutching Jamal as he shivered against her, his small frame a lifeline in the storm. The hospital bombing's echo still rattled her skull, flames and screams from the TV looping in her mind, Hensley's allies striking blind to bury her fight. She'd thought Jamal was lost, presumed dead in the rubble, until she'd held him, safe by a fluke, discharged hours before the blast. Her burns throbbed untreated, her spirit a jagged edge honed by loss. Marcus beaten dead, Carla shot, Jamal snatched twice, the shack torched, and now this, a war she'd ignited with files and truth, answered with blood and fire. She rocked. Jamal, his whimpers soft, "Mama, why's it loud?" And she kissed his bandaged brow, no words left to soothe the terror she'd dragged him through. The burner phone buzzed in her sock, Brooks's voice crackling through. "LaToya, we've got Pierce," Ledger's aired, Hensley's cornered. "Stay low." She hung up, chest tight, the FBI's net closing, but not fast enough. Hensley's smirk haunted her, a ghost in every shadow, his empire cracking yet still clawing her life apart. She couldn't wait, couldn't hide, not with Jamal trembling, not with the beast still breathing. She glanced at the motel's rusted steak knife on the table, a desperate plan sparking. "Simone," she whispered into the phone, "get Jamal somewhere safe. I'm ending this." Simone protested, voice sharp, but LaToya cut her off. He's all I've got. Keep him alive. She kissed Jamal, tears falling, and slipped out as Simone's car rattled up, his small hand waving through the window as they vanished into the night. Latoya broke into a pawn shop 2 blocks down, the glass crunching under her sneaker, Burns screaming as she grabbed a handgun, its weight cold and foreign in her grip. She'd never fired one, never wanted to, but Hensley had taken everything, her job, her home, her son's safety, and she'd make him face her, make him bleed if it came to that. The courthouse loomed in the humid dark, a relic of power. She stormed, slipping past a dozing guard, her breath shallow as she climbed to his chambers. The door creaked open, and there he sat, Judge Virgil Hensley, silver hair glinting under a desk lamp, his robe off, a glass of bourbon in hand, that smirk curling his lips as he looked up. "Miss Harris," he drawled, voice syrupy. "You're a stubborn one." She leveled the gun, hands trembling, Burns flaring, her voice a growl. "Where's my son, you bastard? What did you do?" Hensley laughed, a slow, mocking rumble, leaning back in his chair, unfazed by the barrel. "Your boy. Pierce's idea, not mine. Kidnapped him to shut you up, bombed the hospital to clean the mess. Broke you good, didn't it?" Her finger tightened on the trigger, rage boiling, his confession a match to her fire. "You framed me, killed Marcus Carla, torched my life. Why?" His smirk widened, eyes glinting. "You're a pest, Harris. Pierce needed a fall guy, and you fit. Black. Poor nobody. I just signed the papers, kept Crestmont clean." She stepped closer, gun steadying, tears streaking her face. "You're done. FBI's got it all." He sipped his bourbon, calm as death. "Maybe, but you're nothing without that kid. Pierce ordered him dead, after the shack. Pity the drone missed." Latoya's scream ripped free, the gun shaking, her vision red as she lunged, barrel inches from his skull. "Say it again, you racist pig, and I'll blow that smirk off your face." Hensley's laugh faltered, a flicker of fear in his pale eyes, but he leaned in, daring her. "Go on, shoot. Prove you're the animal they say." Her finger twitched, every nerve screaming to pull, to end him, when the door burst open. Agent Tyrone Brooks storming in, badge flashing, gun drawn. "Drop it, Latoya." She froze, breath ragged, the room spinning as Brooks tackled Hensley, cuffs snapping tight, the judge cursing. "This is slander." Brooks yanked him up, voice steel. "You're under arrest, Hensley. Conspiracy, bribery, murder." Pierce sang, ledgers aired, "It's over." Latoya lowered the gun, collapsing to her knees, the weapon clattering, her sobs breaking free as Brooks dragged Hensley out, his protests fading down the hall. She'd nearly killed, nearly lost herself, but he was gone, the smirk cuffed, the beast bleeding out. Pierce nabbed Ledger's national news, her truth roaring loud, and she curled on the floor, exhaustion claiming her, thinking it was done, justice clawing through the ash. Minutes stretched, the chambers silent but for her gasps, until the burner buzzed, Simone's voice cutting through. "Latoya, pick up!" She fumbled it to her ear, heart lurching. "What?" Simone's tone trembled, fierce and soft. "Jamal's alive. A nurse hid him during the bombing, kept him off records. He's safe, I've got him." Latoya's cry split the air, relief flooding her veins, a lifeline she hadn't dared hope for. "Alive?" she choked, and Simone laughed, shaky. "Yeah, tough kid. Meet us at the diner now." Latoya staggered up, legs jelly, Burns screaming, and ran, the courthouse blurring past, her mind a storm of Jamal's face, his smile, his life. She burst into the diner, a greasy hole off the highway, and there he was, Jamal, perched on a stool, crayons in hand, his bandaged brow crinkling as he saw her. "Mama!" he yelled, leaping into her arms, and she sank to the floor, sobbing, holding him tight, his warmth erasing the nightmare's weight. Simone stood by, eyes wet, and Latoya clutched her too, a broken family pieced back. The TV above the counter blared, "Judge Hensley arrested, bank CEO indicted." The ledgers scrolling, her fight etched in every frame. She'd stormed his lair, faced his sneer, nearly pulled the trigger, and won. Jamal alive, Hensley caged, Pierce nailed. But his smirk lingered in her mind, a scar she'd carry. The cost of justice, a weight she'd never shake. Latoya Harris stood in a cramped Atlanta apartment, months after the Crestmont chaos. the air crisp with a rare Georgia chill, the hum of a new life buzzing around her. Jamal played on the floor, his crayons scratching paper, his laughter a balm on her scarred soul, the bandage long gone from his brow. She'd rebuilt here, far from Hensley's smirk, Pierce's claws, the town that had chewed her up and spat her out. The FBI had nailed them. Pierce indicted, his ledgers splashed across every screen. Hensley arrested, his chambers a memory she'd stormed with a stolen gun. She'd held Jamal again, sobbed into his hair in that diner, thought the nightmare was Ash, the beast slain. Her burns had healed to faint pink lines, her hands steady as she stirred coffee, the USB drive a ghost of a fight she'd won. But the weight lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake, the cost of justice carved into her bones. She'd landed a job at a small financial firm, a quiet place that admired her grit, the manager nodding at her story with a mix of awe and pity. The paycheck was thin, but it kept the lights on. Jamal in school, his gap-toothed grin back as he chattered about math and friends. Simone visited often, her braids swinging as she cooked, filling the space with laughter and plans. A sister, forged in fire. The news had moved on, Crestmont a footnote, but LaToya's name echoed in whispers, a symbol of defiance she hadn't asked to be. She spoke at a rally that morning, a crowd of hundreds in a downtown park, her voice steady as she told her tale, framed, hunted, nearly broken, but standing. "Keep fighting," she'd said, their cheers a roar she felt in her chest, a spark of purpose amid the scars. The apartment was humble, a step up from motels and shacks, its walls bare but warm, Jamal's drawings taped up like trophies. She sipped her coffee, watching him color a rocket, his small world safe, her heart swelling with a fragile peace. Pierce faced trial soon, his empire dust, the ledgers tying him to millions siphoned, black employees like her framed to hide it. Hensley awaited his own reckoning, locked in a federal cell, his smirk caged, the conspiracy charges piling high. Agent Brooks had called last week, voice gruff but warm. "You did it, LaToya, they're done." She'd smiled then, faint but real, thinking the fight was buried, the system cracked open by her hands. Afternoon light slanted through the window, and she stepped to the mailbox, a routine she'd reclaimed. The clank of metal, a small victory. A plain envelope waited, no stamp, no return address, her name scrawled in black ink. She frowned, tearing it open, and a photo slipped out, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her breath stopped, coffee mug slipping from her grip, shattering on the tile. There was Hensley, silver hair glinting, standing outside a sprawling mansion, his smirk wide, free, a glass of bourbon raised as if toasting her. A note fluttered down, typed cold. "New judge, same game." LaToya's knees buckled, the room spinning, Jamal's voice. "Mama, what's wrong?" A distant echo as she sank, clutching the photo, rage and dread clawing her chest. She dialed Brooks, hands trembling, the burner long gone, but his number etched in her mind. "Tyrone, it's LaToya," she rasped as he picked up, voice tight. "Hensley's out, I've got a picture, he's free, grinning like nothing happened." Silence stretched, then Brooks cursed, low and fierce. "What?" "That's impossible, he's locked up, trial's set." She choked, tears pricking. "Check please, I'm holding it, he's out there." He hung up, promising answers, and she sat, staring at the photo, Hensley's smirk a knife twisting. Old wounds. Jamal crawled to her, small hands on her face. "Don't cry, Mama," and she hugged him, his warmth a shield against the storm brewing in her gut. Brooks called back an hour later, his tone grim, a weight she felt through the line. "LaToya, he bribed his way out. New judge, federal pull, some backroom deal. Vanished this morning off the grid. We're hunting, but he's got friends, deep ones." Her scream lodged in her throat, the phone shaking as she gripped it. "How? After everything, the ledgers, the arrests?" Brooks sighed, heavy. "Systems, rotten higher than we thought. Pierce is down, but Hensley's a snake, slipped the noose. Stay safe, we'll find him." The line died, and she dropped it, the photo glaring from the floor, Hensley's triumph a slap she couldn't dodge. She stood, legs jelly, and scooped Jamal up, his questions soft. "Who's that man, Mama?" She forced a smile, throat tight. "Nobody, baby, just a picture." But the lie burned, the truth a weight crushing her fragile peace. She'd fought, bled, lost friends, nearly lost him, and won. Pierce caged, the conspiracy aired, her name cleared. But Hensley was free, his smirk a promise the beast wasn't dead, just coiled, waiting. She locked the door, checked the windows. The apartment a cage now, not a home. The rally's cheers faded in her mind, hollow against this reversal. The system's rot running deeper than she'd dreamed. A hydra growing heads she couldn't. Cut night fell, Atlanta's skyline glittering beyond the glass, and Latoya sat by Jamal's bed, his breathing steady, her coffee cold beside her. She'd thought justice was hers, a hard-won prize, but Hensley's escape tore it open, a wound, bleeding fresh. The FBI hunted, Brooks swore it, but she knew the game. Money, power, white hands shaking white hands, and her, a black woman who dared to stand, still prey in their eyes. She traced Jamal's face, his innocence her anchor, and vowed to fight on, not for rallies or headlines, but for him, for the life they deserved. The photo lay on the table, Hensley's smirk a dare, and she stared back, rage hardening her spine, a mother's love her steel. She stepped to the window, city lights a blur through tears, the realization sinking in. She'd toppled a judge, her CEO shaken Crestmont to its core, but the system stretched beyond, a web of smirks and deals she couldn't unravel alone. Jamal stirred, murmuring in sleep, and she turned, kneeling by him, her hand on his. She'd won battles, saved him twice, but the war wasn't over. Hensley's freedom a clarion call that justice was a lie dressed in robes. She'd carry the scars, burns, blood, loss forever, a warrior marked by a fight that wouldn't end. Her resolve a flame flickering but alive, burning for the day she'd face that smirk again and bury it for good. Latoya Harris's journey in racist Judge Smirks as black woman stands alone in court, then she summons FBI authorities to expose him, teaches us resilience in the face of unrelenting injustice. Her fight against a corrupt system, embodied by Judge Virgil Hensley and Roland Pierce, shows that truth can pierce even the thickest walls of power, but not without cost. She lost friends, her home, and nearly her son, Jamal, yet her spirit never fully broke, proving that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to push through it. The story reveals the brutal reality of systemic racism, where innocence is no shield, and justice bends to wealth and influence. Latoya's victories, exposing Pierce's crimes, seeing Hensley cuffed, were hard-won, yet his escape underscores a bitter truth. The system often protects its own, leaving the vulnerable to fight again. Her story urges us to question who justice serves and to stand firm, even when the odds stack high. It's a call to recognize the unseen battles others face and to amplify their voices, because silence lets the beast thrive. Latoya's love for Jamal fueled her, a reminder that personal stakes can drive monumental change, but the fight's never truly over when corruption runs deep. What's your takeaway from her struggle? Comment below if her grit inspires you. Hit like if you're fired up by her stand, and subscribe to catch more tales of defiance. Share if you believe truth deserves a louder voice. Thanks for joining this ride. May you find strength to face your own giants.